and thanks to all of you for having me here. It's an honor to be here and share my story, our story here in Atlanta. And for any of you who are not from Atlanta, welcome. If you haven't had a chance yet to get out and see the Atlanta Beltline, I hope that you will. I'm going to start talking about the Beltline. I'm going to give it some context for what I've learned about it. We're still in the early stage of building it, but I think you'll see it as sort of part of a much larger kind of story. I did work with Commissioner Keene on the city design, and he's going to present that, and then we can have, I think there's plenty of time for discussion following. This is what most people think about when they think about Atlanta. It's not where I want to live necessarily, but it's certainly where I have always lived. I grew up in the suburbs of Atlanta. I grew up, stuck in traffic, driving to the mall. That was just my life. Didn't know any better until I came here to Georgia Tech to study architecture in the early 90s. And I spent my senior year abroad in Paris and fell in love with Paris and with cities generally, really. This is me. My subway pass image on my subway card when I was 22 years old in Paris. Within a month of being there, I had lost 15 pounds. I was in the best shape of my life because I was eating fresh food and I was walking wherever I went. And I fell in love with this idea that the physical city had something to do with my own personal health and happiness, that it shaped the opportunities that were available for me to live the life that I wanted. I didn't know that I wanted that kind of life, but I really was enamored with it. I came home after a year there, lived with my parents, took a job in an architecture firm across town where I had to drive across our perimeter highway every day, for 40 minutes or so, sitting there in a car, passing hundreds of thousands of people, but not seeing anybody, not moving a muscle, gaining that weight back, and realizing that this infrastructure that I was using was a barrier to the life that I wanted. I couldn't live the way I wanted to live in that kind of a place. So I got really interested in how you would transform Atlanta and all of its shortcomings and its assets into the kind of place that I wanted to live. So I came back to graduate school here at Tech. I basically spent the 90s at Tech and came up with this idea, my graduate thesis, which was both design and planning, but design at a city scale. How do you design this place to become that kind of thing? How do you reinvent these infrastructures and these spaces that we already have into something new that would create some new opportunities? And so the idea for the Atlanta Beltline was to reuse this loop of old railroads that circle the city. It's fairly close into the city. It was built as a circle line, as we heard before, at the periphery of the city, back when the city was very small. But as the city grew after the American Civil War, it jumped across those railroads. The railroads were barriers between places, and the city, everybody moved out of the city with white flag and suburbanization, and left all of this territory behind. And by the time I was in school here at Tech in the 1990s, the city had stabilized itself. It had lost about a fifth of its population in the 1970s and 80s to suburbanization, but it had kind of stabilized, and you could see that the city was going to probably start to grow again. But it was nothing like what you see now. So that idea was to reposition this loop of old abandoned railroads to something that would accommodate that growth and transform these communities into the kind of places where people really wanted to live. It would revitalize the community, the 45 different neighborhoods along the way, and incentivize the redevelopment of all that industrial land. So this is the idea, to convert that old railroad into both a tram or transit line and a multi-use trail for the full 22-mile loop. It connects to our existing subway system at each of the 4 compass points. The trail connects an emerging kind of regional trail network. And it really it organizes a lot of growth in this abandoned industrial corridor. You can see from the map here, it is all the yellow is the old industrial land that was mostly left behind. So it's not just the railroad that was a barrier between places, it's that this whole wide swath of industrial land. I'm sorry, I meant to put up the metric version of my numbers up here. It's 35 kilometers in circumference, 3 to 5 kilometers away from downtown in any direction. So downtown is the center. We are about, here at Georgia Tech, we're about right in the shadow right there. So we're within this loop. You know, I thought it was a cool idea, but I just wanted to graduate, which I did. I never imagined we would actually do it. I went to work at an architecture firm. We were doing mixed-use urban infill projects because, again, developers were starting to buy these big industrial tracts and reposition them for the future. And we were doing that kind of work. And we had this one site, a 20-acre property that was going to significantly increase the population of the adjacent neighborhood. And we were trying to decide, do you take the parking garage and jam it up against the abandoned railroad, or do you organize it toward the railroad, hoping that would become something else one day? And I was telling my coworkers about this idea I had in school, about that very railroad. And they thought it was cool because they lived in neighborhoods nearby, we were doing work in that corridor, and so we started talking to people about it. And the more people we talked to, the more people wanted to hear about it, so we started talking to more people. This is the summer of 2001. We sent out a letter with some maps to everybody we could think of, the governor, the mayor, all the regional transportation agencies, the State Department of Transportation. Got a lot of nice letters back saying, nice idea, good luck with that. but got a great response from one person. Kathy Woolard was on city council. She was chair of the transportation committee, which is why she got this letter. And she was frustrated with all the regional transit agencies who said, we're trying to get people from the downtown area out to the far-flung parts of the region and back, but not really for working on anything that would support the people who live in the city. The people who are more likely to want transit, more likely to ride transit, more likely to pay for transit, have been paying for transit for 30 years with MARTA at that time. And a large proportion of people who are dependent on transit to get around because they can't afford a car. There was nothing for them in any of those plans. And she was just frustrated by that. And she literally, from that meeting, went back to her office and this letter was on her desk. And she thought, wow, this is for people in my community. So she called us in, we told her more about the idea. We hosted a town hall meeting in her district, and the neighborhood fell in love with this idea. We did a few more of those. That fall, she was elected city council president, and so we took that conversation citywide, and for the next 2.5 years, I was doing 3 and 4 meetings a week, and so was she and her staff and a handful of volunteers, and we created this incredible grassroots movement of people who fell in love with this vision for what they wanted their city to look like. And ultimately, they empowered their elected officials to start doing it, and ultimately obligated them to do it, to do the hard work of paying for it and doing the politics of engaging the very complex, expensive project. But the love that people had for this idea and for their own city is what really made all of that possible. You can see now this area is now the tracks are just ripped up. This section is about to be converted for the third section of trail on the south side, but a lot of it just looked like this. You're only 3 kilometers from the center of downtown, but you feel like you're out in the country. It's just abandoned urban land. And so the idea again is transportation, both the transit and trail for the full 22-mile loop. Economic development. So for communities that are already experiencing growth, it was a way to manage that growth. And in the face of higher densities and traffic. And in the south and the west, where there hadn't been any new investment in 30 or 40 years, the Beltline would incentivize that kind of investment to those communities. And then it would connect existing parks and cultural assets. The botanical gardens is on the loop, the zoo is on the route, the King District and the Carter Center. Those kinds of places are already on the loop, and so we connect those kinds of things together. What was crazy is that the more people that got involved in the project, the more people that fell in love with this idea and wanted to be a part of it, the bigger the idea got. So the Trust for Public Land came in 2004 and said, that's cute that you guys want to connect 700 acres of existing parks, but what about building 1,400 acres of new parks carved out of that old industrial belt, including that quarry up there, which will be the new city's new largest park, and also add 30 days of emergency drinking water to the city, which currently has 3. Mayor Franklin at the time said, what better place for affordable housing than on a transit line where you can afford to ditch your car and other expenses. And so now it's one of the largest affordable housing initiatives in the city's history. that's great for new housing, but what about people who are already in these communities who are low income, fixed income, and some, facing rising taxes and rents? And there's a toolkit of things that are coming together to support them. Now, I'm not saying on either of those things that we're doing everything that we need to do, or that we're accomplishing that vision, but it's certainly part of the vision, and the delivery of the project is accountable to those promises. It also became a big public art project, preservation, historic preservation of this industrial heritage. Trees Atlanta came up with this idea for a linear arboretum, and so it's now also a public arboretum. And so the ideas just kept coming and going, big and small, from organizations all over, including the Bocce Ball Association wants to put bocce ball courts around it. The farmers market people want to put farmers markets around it. People put swings and trees and do stuff because they kind of own this idea. And they're not only owners of this vision, they're also authors in what it is and what it can be. I could bore you to death with all of the people and organizations that it takes to pull this thing off. It's a full partnership of all sorts of public, private, nonprofit partners, led primarily by the Atlanta Beltline Inc., but with obviously a full suite of partners at every level of government and in every aspect of private life. The cool thing about it is that we're not just drawing pretty pictures about it and doing it, but we're actually building it. This is the East Side Trail, which opened in 2012. So 2 miles of the 22-mile total was the first mainline section to open. This is one of the new parks. This is the historic Fourth Ward Park, which doubles as a stormwater retention facility. It keeps everything downstream from flooding so that it's suitable for redevelopment. And that's a beautiful part. So we're still in the early stages of implementation. You can see that we've got 3 main sections of trail built. That it basically amounts to almost half of the loop. This one is next. So the city just announced they're about to start break ground on the trail for that. We do not yet have transit in the corridor. We did a vote for referendum 2.5 years ago to pay for that, so pieces of it at least are coming. But you can see how, and we're a little bit behind, but you can see how it's sort of mapped out to be delivered over the next 15 years or so. Again, even though we're not done, it's still already changing our lives, right? So the city has spent about $500 million so far. That's mostly on land acquisition and construction for new parks and trails. In the same time period, though, we've seen over $4 billion of private sector investment in the corridor. New offices, condos, apartments, retail, restaurants, all of that kind of thing. Life really flourishing throughout this corridor. That's $4 billion built. There's another $4 billion in the pipeline on its way. More important than that, of course, is that it is changing the way that people live their lives. It's creating a way of life possible, making a way of life possible that just wasn't possible before. I'll illustrate that with this image. This is, This is what the East Side Trail looked like just a few years ago, and this is what it looks like now. This picture, though, is a few years old. I had taken my kids out on a bike ride, and they were up ahead of me, and I'm in the back, taking pictures on my phone, trying not to have a wreck. And I got home, and I was flipping through my pictures, and I decided this is my favorite picture I've ever taken of the Beltline in 15 years of working on it at that time. And it's not because it's a beautiful spring day, and the sky was this beautiful blue, and the leaves had just popped out. It's not because people are walking by literally talking about how in love they are with Atlanta, which is funny. It's this woman on the right with the red hair. She's carrying her groceries, and in the process, she's validating everything that we said that Beltline would do. It's making a way of life possible that wasn't possible before. It's helping transform this very car-centered place into some other kind of place where you can live a different kind of life if you want. And we're not even done with it. The running shoulder's not built. The ramps and stairs are not all in. The transit's not there. There's a Whole Foods right off the corner of this thing. You can't even get down there because there's no way to get down the hill. So imagine how much change has already come, how much more is going to come. So, you can tell, I've told that story a lot. It's a great story, and we've got a long way to go to make sure that the project lives up to the promise of that story. But time is also going by, and I know that young people today weren't around when we built that grassroots movement, that we have a lot of new neighbors in town who haven't heard that story. And so I wanted to write a story about it, write a book about it, and so I did. What I didn't realize is that I wasn't really writing a book about infrastructure. I was writing a book about my grandma. Because I started to see that it's written as a narrative, right? So it's more than just infrastructure and wonky kind of urban planning things, right? This is our life that we're creating. These are the spaces and the ways that we live our life. I love this idea of the art and science of urban living because it's more than just the science part. We have to have the technical stuff, but we also have to have a reason to live. And when you love a city, and we'll talk more about this with the city design, when you love it, then you make better decisions about it, and you know people. So anyway, I'll fast forward through this part of it, but basically I started to see that my grandmother was unwittingly part of a different kind of a story for American urban life that happened in the mid-century when people left cities. They left them behind. They were in a small town in Louisiana. They probably got a federal home loan that was only available to white people. They rented their rooms in their home to servicemen during World War II. They participated in the suburbanization of America, and they really radically changed the world. We call that urban sprawl, but at that time they just called it the future. And it's important to understand that you can't really separate the physical construction of the world around us from the other things that are happening in our lives. You know, at that time, science was curing disease and lifting us to the moon. The sexual revolution was breaking down barriers. The civil rights movement had begun its march toward the fulfillment of our nation's promise. And all of these things were happening at the very same time that were radically changing the way that we build the built form of the city and the way that we live our lives. Yes, private sector is innovating in automobiles, but more than that, also air conditioning and entertainment systems and food systems and the way that we, just very fundamental aspects of the way that we live. Meanwhile, the public sector is also innovating in the infrastructure to support that aspiration by building new kinds of roadways, testing surfaces for driving on, the geometries of highways. All that didn't happen overnight. It happened over a span of time that was an evolution that we all participated in, and with kind of unknowingly sort of ended up with a lot of the challenges that we face today. So we were building infrastructure, but we were also building lives for ourselves. The book also tells a story about then how my family moved from Louisiana to Atlanta to take advantage of this economy that was a direct result of all the highways Atlanta was building. My dad took a job with an engineering firm designing pump stations and wastewater treatment plants to support the sprawling economy of the region. We bought a house in a neighborhood that was incentivized by the construction of our perimeter highway in the same way that apartments are popping up on the Beltline. We were part of that story also, and it lifted millions of people to economic prosperity, including my parents who grew up poor. But it wasn't available to everybody, and so when you start thinking about how this role of the city and the construction and formation of the city shapes our lives, looking forward, we certainly need to make sure that those things are done more equitably. And which gets back to the Beltline too. So right, I grew up, like I said, stuck in traffic going to the mall. My kids are growing up with the Beltline as their worldview. That's what shapes their expectations for their own lives. I took them to the grocery store. This is a couple years ago now, and they were complaining about it because they didn't want to get in the car. They were like, "Oh, do we have to go?" And I said, "They said if we have to go, can't we ride our bikes?" And I was like, "Yeah, well, sure, we can ride our bikes. That's what people in Atlanta do. We ride our bikes to the grocery store." You know, they have no idea how ridiculous that is of a request. Most people in Atlanta do not ride their bikes to the grocery store. Partly because it would never even cross their mind. Partly because if they did, they'd get killed, you know? And so, but my kids don't have any idea that that's a thing. And so from where we live and we have a grocery store on the Beltline, we can ride our bikes there. It's the fastest way to get there. It's certainly the healthiest, most sustainable way to get there. And so it's fascinating to see them, the world kind of shaping their lives. And so you think about the Beltline, yes, it's a transportation project. Yes, it's economic development. Yes, it's all of these things. But it's also an aspiration for what kind of lives we want. you know. And so when people come to town and they look at the Beltline, like you, if you're visiting, you might look at, you know, you might want to dig into the history and the story and that kid from Georgia Tech and all that. But mostly you're looking at, wow, what is this doing to Atlanta? Look at what's happening. Look what's flourishing here. And so when the New York Times comes to town, you know, they're talking about, you know, that story, but they're really talking about what's changing, you know. And I don't usually walk down the trail playing my violin, tugging my dog in the back of the cooler. But this lady's out there all the time. She's living the life that she wants. She's making the rest of our lives richer in the process. And so, you know, my morning commute, you know, my sweet dog's last walk, people out there in every time of day, in every season, really just living their lives. And yes, going places and doing things. But if you eavesdrop on some young people in any coffee shop along the way, you'll hear that it's where they live, it's where they work, it's who they date, it's what they do on Saturday night. People organizing their lives around this, which is just really, really crazy. This is my daughter on the right. That's her worldview. That's her expectation for Atlanta. This is not a special event. This is your ordinary winter weekday afternoon. It's crazy. This is a woman I met a couple of years ago. She's a fashion designer, started a new business. She likes the Beltline for the transit and economic development and parks and stuff, but what she really likes is that it's going to bring an economy to her community that supports her business and supports her family, allows her to send her kids to college, just like those highways did for me and for my family, which is really cool. And if you haven't been on the Beltline and you're coming back, you should come back for the Lantern Parade. Anybody been to the Lantern Parade? A couple of you, handful. You should come back. I think it's the second Saturday in September, maybe. But this woman had this idea that people would make homemade lanterns and walk down the trail in the dark. Sounds ridiculous. The first year they did it, there were like 200 people showed up. That was before the trail was even built, and that was pretty cool. The next year there were 400 people, the next year 800 people, the next year 1,200 people, the next year there were 12,000 people, the next year 20,000, then 60,000, then 80,000. So this thing that, I mean, that when I talk about the cultural side of infrastructure, this is what I'm talking about. The Beltline right now is basically a 2-mile slab of concrete. That's really it. You know, it's a special slab, and I love it. But what it's doing is it's creating a way of life. It's making things possible that wouldn't have happened before. That's what. So that's that. What's interesting in my work is that the Beltline has opened all kinds of doors for me, and you're starting to see all kinds of other things happen. I travel all over the world talking about the Beltline. For some reason, people want to hear the story, which just makes it fun for me because I get to see the world. But everywhere I go, there's something happening in that city. And that project that you shared is like so similar, and it's different of course, but similar in so many ways. That's always the case. There's always something happening, and it's not just old abandoned railroads, but also degraded urban waterways and obsolete roadways. People reimagining these things so that they deliver the kind of lives that they want. It's really cool to see that. In my own work, I've been involved in several projects that do that are focused on that also. I don't have time to share them all, but one of them, for some reason I ended up working on these river projects, but the most fun was the one that Commissioner Keene is going to share with you, and I had the honor to work with him on, which was the Atlanta City design. I won't go into that. But one other cool thing about that, well, the context for it is that the region is growing. So for people who say we don't want the city to grow, we don't want to change, not changing is not really an option. And that's true for most big cities in the world. They are changing. And so the question of how that infrastructure is used, who it's used for, who it benefits, these are things that everybody's sort of struggling with and working on. So Atlanta is growing enormously by 2.5 million more people in the next 20 years, which is crazy. In a city that's completely unprepared for that, by the way. The city of Atlanta will probably triple its growth during that time frame. So not changing is not really an option. So whether we want to talk about mass global urbanization or the inequities and disparities that come with growth and change, or the technological revolution, not only in mobility, but also things like digital privacy and all kinds of things like that, the environmental degradation that also comes that we either are doing now or have to mitigate. What do we do with this last 60 years of obsolete infrastructure that is becoming more of a burden to the way that we want to live? The suburbanization of poverty is a big deal in Atlanta. And then the social isolation and political polarization that we see in this country right now, very much tied to, at least partly, the physical limitations of our infrastructure. We don't see anybody. We don't talk to them. We don't know them in any way. So we don't see each other as part of the same community. We don't vote to support each other's issues. And I think that's a big part of it. Of course, every city, certainly Atlanta, is not facing any one of those challenges. It's facing them all at the same time. And again, wait, there's 2 sets of these slides. That's funny. This is me, last minute changing my slide deck. I'm almost done, I promise. So here we are. And then, so why do we care? Why should we care? It's all messy, right? But, it's not to be cheesy, but it's our kids, So we have to, Tim and I were just talking, it's not just about coming up with the idea. We have to actually do it. We have to follow through on that and actually do these things so we're preparing the city for a new generation. So thank you all for giving me time to share this.